Hello, it is April 22nd, 2020. My name is Greg Farrar, and this is my COVID-19 Trends live stream. So I'll go over the countries of the world, the states of California, states of the United States, and the counties of California.
Hello, it is April 22nd,
Okay.
2020.
Let's see if I can turn off my own sound so I don't hear myself. All right. Yesterday, I saw that some people did not figure out that when the stream cut out due to my Wi-Fi, that it came back shortly thereafter as a different video. So if you do want to see the remainder of yesterday's session, it's there. It's on YouTube. It has, I think, the same date and everything. There are just two of them. This time I'm not using the big monitor because, bizarrely, I think my big monitor, when I plug it in, blocks my Wi-Fi signal. I've heard other people have this problem too. So I'm not going to hook up the monitor because I think it risks my network connection when I use my monitor, which is kind of funny. Something about the frequencies being the same, I presume, of Wi-Fi and USB-C. Anyway, let's go. Countries, cases by country. As always, the United States has far more cases than anyone total. Spain, Italy, Germany, and so on, Europe, in other words, have a lot of cases, but let's just move on to the new cases per day. Here again, we can see the United States. There is news today, the beginning of news. There's a spike in LA, and the number of cases for the United States and for other places, parts of the United States, are higher today than they have been recently. You can see this here, but it's Los Angeles, as we'll see, is especially surprisingly high. So there seems to be some sort of a resurgence of the virus in certain places, or at least a resurgence in the number of reported cases. But anyway, still we could imagine this is an outlier. Generally pretty flat. I mean, it's very wavy, but generally the total new cases has stayed roughly around that 30,000 mark for every day for a while in the United States. It's not turning around, obviously. It's not obviously turning around, but it is not shooting off upwards necessarily either. But as we see, it looks like it might be headed that way. All right, my graph's going to do something weird. I'm not going to fight my graph today. I'll just move on to the per million, which gives the same shape of the curves anyway, and is probably more useful because it breaks down countries by how they compare to each other in total cases per million, total new cases per million. Ireland dominating right now. This is just recently, really. It's taken the lead and is well ahead of other countries in the top 25 in cases per million, and it seems to be headed upward still. Belgium flattening off. United States probably flattening off, has been flat for a while, as we saw. United Kingdom maybe not flattening off. We'll see much better in the next graph what the expected directions of these curves will be to bend in coming days. Spain, Switzerland, Italy, we can see these nice downward curves. Lots of other countries where or several other countries where the trends are downward now. It's going to do that, is it? I'll just move on to the next graph. I think what's happening, I've been seeing more and more of this, is I just have too many points for my software to really handle. I can reload the whole page and it'll be fine, or I can make do without my lines, but it's really pretty hard to make sense of of this. Any particular one, though, it's fairly clear anyway what the trend is without the lines. But I think I'm just going to need to stop going all the way back to March 1st and maybe just go back to, I don't know, March 15th or something, because I'm seeing a definite acceleration in the number of times these graphs fail on me. And I'm guessing we're going to see more of that today as we go along. So the rope chart, I sure hope I get to zoom in on the rope chart. Real shame if I can't zoom in on the rope chart. But overall, the rope chart, as it has for a week, or many weeks really since about March 22nd, the rope chart is looking good. The rope chart shows the growth in new cases as a percentage by country. And so any country that's above 0 here is a country that's seeing a growth of new cases every day, more new cases every day. And if it's below 0, it's seeing fewer new cases each day than the day before. And as we can see, almost everyone is seeing fewer new cases. Almost all countries in the top 25 are seeing fewer new cases. And that one day or two, when we looked at the top 50, it wasn't much different. There may be some very small countries that are seeing extremely high or low growth, but the trend of in all the countries that contribute significantly to the number of world cases is good, is downward. The trend is downward. These countries have all turned the corner, and there are only maybe 5 that haven't. Let's see if my Zoom works. Go Zoom. I'm going to reload the page. Very sad. So that's good news. It wasn't long ago that when we tried to look at this rope chart, it was clear. It was clear even from the beginning of when I started doing this series that it was headed in this direction, but it was not clear. It had not yet crossed there. All right, see, I see these sad faces on my graphs. That's my first hint that something is problematic, but usually I can fix that by just double-clicking, and then zooming. In case I'm not going to be able to zoom here, though, I'll try to work from the zoomed out version. Actually, I could probably zoom like this. I wonder if that'll work. Sort of, but it gets a little blurry. Ecuador, Saudi Arabia, Russia. Really, Ecuador and Saudi Arabia, both of them small contributors, are the major ones. Russia and India, both trending downward, both trending towards a recovery, towards a negative growth. So neither of these are in serious trouble, and their percentages at 10% and 5% are not extreme. But Saudi Arabia and Ecuador are more problematic, and we can see that Ecuador it's still hanging out the bottom there. But Saudi Arabia, which wasn't even on our radar a week ago, has moved up. And so is Peru, by the way. I think Peru has been moving up. I'm going to see if I can zoom. It's all right if I can't. Oh, this time it's going to let me. Great. But yeah, so Ecuador and Saudi Arabia are really the only bad news on this graph. Everyone else is trending downward, and the majority of them have crossed 0. So great. The world's looking good. The world graph as a whole is flattening out. And more importantly, or more tellingly maybe, the world graph is showing a continued slight trend downward. As we've noted a few times, there is a wave here. It could just be coincidence, but we've seen it enough that we kind of doubt it. It was like a big wave, and then the wave's getting smaller, and it's when I counted, it seems to be 8 days long. The period of this wave seems to be 8 days. And that is, I'd have no idea why that would be. If it were 7 days, I'd say, oh, okay, it's because they don't report on the weekends or something, and then they gradually catch up on the weekends. It's just a reporting issue. Or I don't know, maybe people go out on the weekends and or go to work on the weekdays, and there's something about when they get infected that causes this the growth rates to rise and shrink. But I don't know. I do know, though, that if this continues, we're going to see a little bit more of an upward curve here in the coming days. And so this thing, which is just barely below 0, saying that the world has just turned the corner, will probably bend to slightly above 0 in the days to come, and then bend back downward. Because though there's a wave, the wave is gradually, as a whole, getting lower. And so there does seem to be a trend for the world to head towards negative growth. And at this point, officially, according to my official trend line goes, it is actually at negative growth right now today. We're not going to spend too much time on deaths, but maybe just look at the countries. Belgium leads per capita, United Kingdom, Sweden. We can see that Spain, which used to be such a leader in deaths, in Italy for that matter, have both turned the corner weeks and weeks ago and are now being passed by the likes of United Kingdom and Belgium and Sweden. And I guess there's another one here. Maybe I can grab Ireland. Ireland has sometimes been troubled. Let's just look at it if it lets us. Oh, it let me. How nice. Ireland not looking so great on this graph. There's been especially one really big day It's clearly not leveling out anyway. We'll get a better sense on the rope chart. Let's look at Ireland on the rope chart. Ireland. By the way, the chat is here as well. I guess I was hearing some people can't post in the chat. I'm not sure why that would be. I'll say something. I can't even see my chat to see whether it's probably misspelled that, but since I'm working on a small screen, it's almost completely taken by this graph. But if you can chat, people sometimes do chat, drop something in chat. If you can't chat, drop a comment later and tell me you couldn't, and I'll try to fix that for tomorrow. I know there are options where I can turn it off, but I didn't think I had. So yeah, Ireland is doing all right. It's and this is again an example of why this kind of chart, which is normally all you'll see in other sources, just doesn't tell us what to me is the most important thing, which is this getting better? You look at this chart and you say, oh, this is terrible. We're getting more and more cases in Ireland every day. This is the new cases per day, or deaths rather. More and more deaths every day. That's terrible. It's going upwards. There's no end in sight. But if you look at this thing, which does the more subtle analysis of the angle of that curve, if you see that though it looks like a line, really looks like a line, it's not quite. It's slightly bending downward, that line, and you can see here in a much more visible way that Ireland is heading toward recovery. And that recovery will look like this line becoming completely straight at first, which indicates that the growth of new cases has leveled, or actually the line will become completely horizontal. It's this line that will become this line will drop back down. So this line will level off to horizontal, and then the line for Ireland here. Shortly thereafter, a few days after this one levels off, then the total cases, no, this is still new daily. Oh, never mind. These are the same graph. This is just per million. I don't have a total deaths, but if we were looking at the total deaths, we would see the line would level off in new cases, then it would drop, and that would eventually cause the total deaths to level off at whatever its maximum value ends up being. So this rope chart here gives us a sense, a pretty good look at the future, at least a few days ahead. Where is Ireland headed? Well, Ireland's headed to zero and probably downward from there, and things are looking pretty good for Ireland. There is one point here, but that may not be a major one. It's probably an outlier. Peru is leading in deaths, continues to and rising. Peru again has risen. There's something going on in Peru with the way that the number of people that are dying, I think, from coronavirus, because if we look at the total cases here, the cases leveled off and the growth rate hit zero a couple days ago, but though there are again exceptional days, and maybe this is indicating a new trend. We won't believe it till we see it 3 or 4 days in a row, but Peru does seem to be having some sort of a problem with treatment, or I don't know, population age, more at-risk people. Something's going on there because they're continuing to rise much more than the rest of the world. The rest of the world has pretty much turned the corner as far as deaths go. If this lets me zoom in, then we'll be able to see there are a few exceptions. One of this is probably the most problematic one. We knew that Japan was in the midst of. It seemed like it had gotten over a very small epidemic, and now it seemed to be in the midst of a new one. So Japan's death rate is still rising and slightly accelerating. India as well. However, if we look at India and Japan on the rope chart, they're not so bad, I believe. Why am I? Oh, wow, it's down here. I think Japan has been dropping. I was sort of expecting to find Japan in the middle here somewhere. Maybe that's where it was a few days ago. But Japan, in terms of new cases, is looking quite good. They're dropping 6% a day in number of new cases, and that rate of drop is accelerating. All three of these, including Peru, including India. India is also, well, their cases are rising, but that is headed towards the zero place where their cases stop rising. So the thing we hate to see is when a line points is above zero and points upwards, is sloping upwards. Do we have any of those? Yeah, that's right. We have two, Ecuador and Saudi Arabia. These are real problems when you see the growth rate is high and rising. When the growth rate is relatively low and falling, it's not something to worry about. We can project that India is going to hit zero, barring some change that makes this trend line move differently. It's not my work here is not to guess how this trend line is going to bend based on new factors in the world. I'm just trying to show what the current trends actually are. And so barring such a change, and there are lots of things that could cause it, India is headed towards recovery, but not Ecuador and Saudi Arabia. So those are going to keep moving up this list to 25 unless they get that under control. That it. Death rate, I'll just say briefly, has dropped below, has been shrinking now for many days. The percentage in new deaths, percentage change in new deaths has been negative. Right now we're seeing about 5% new deaths on average every day worldwide, which is great. Okay, so I have all these sad graphs again. Let's see if I can fix these with my usual trick. Okay, so U.S. states of the United States. We see, as always, New York is going upwards. We still have this anomaly in data that we see pretty much every day where New York reports late, and we see a doubling of data here that makes the New York numbers look slightly more optimistic than they should be. Nevertheless, there is what I think is a visual flattening even of this curve, which is really very good news. When you start to see the total curve flatten, you know that this curve has really got to be heading downward. And so the total cases are almost starting to visibly turn this way. Don't believe that point, but even without that point, you can see that some of these are a little above the line, some are a little below the line, which indicates the line is not quite caught up to the idea that this curve is flattening, but I think it visibly is. But this shows it much more obviously. The curve of the total curve flattens because the total number of cases drop each day. And that's obviously happening for New York. We've got some very firmly established downward trend in new cases in New York, where we used to see 10,000 new cases each day. Now we're seeing 4,000 or 5,000, a much smaller number of new cases each day. New Jersey not looking quite as good, though at least it seems to be flattening out. But really, New York is going to cross it in this graph, I'm pretty sure. In a few days, New York is recovering much better than New Jersey is. Per million. Let's see if this lets me zoom in spite of how many points I gave it. Yes. And so per million, New York has already crossed New Jersey. New Jersey is ahead of everybody in new cases per million. That is flattening off. It is obviously getting better, but still, New Jersey is taking a much slower path to recovery than New York. Rhode Island, meanwhile, is on track to become, in a matter of days, the worst state in total new cases. Was it just yesterday I said I wanted to move to Rhode Island? I think that was because they had such great testing, but I don't want to move to Rhode Island if their trend line looks like this. They're headed upwards and not in a very good way. Nice that they're testing like maniacs, but it looks like they need it. Massachusetts also looking relatively high in new cases, Connecticut, but both of those seeming to level off. We can see a couple of states here, Louisiana and Michigan, that are obviously have turned the corner and are turning downward. But again, this is much better seen on the rope chart. If we want to know who's turning downward, we just look at who's below zero. If we want to know who's heading towards turning downward, we look at which lines are heading towards this zero line. I'm going to zoom in. Cross your fingers again. Yep, it worked. So this is mixed, but generally good. If you just look at the envelope here, the largest line, the smallest line, it kind of looks like this is symmetric around zero, like there's as much bad news as good news. But when you look at the individual lines, that's really not the case. All we have to do is take out the crazily bad state of Ohio for a moment, and you will see that the trend of everyone else, the other 24, are clearly downward, almost all across zero, just a handful above, and some of them doing really well. For instance, Indiana with a 20% growth rate, reduction of new cases every day. New York seeing 15, 16% fewer cases each day. That goes a long way quickly. Michigan seeing about 13% reduction of new cases. And all the rest of these, the only ones that are problematic at all are Mississippi, California, Virginia, Rhode Island, and New Jersey. So I was saying Rhode Island and of course Ohio, which we'll get to as its own separate category. Rhode Island, I was saying, do you want to live in Rhode Island? Well, the testing is great, but the per capita cases are very high. Well, one reason to live in Rhode Island, if you're basing your habitation requirements entirely on COVID-19, is that its trend is downward in growth. It's almost turned the corner, and so soon it will join this pack of other 20 states. So it's still 20th out of 25 in terms of its growth rate. Rhode Island is not doing great, and indeed it was not even on our radar a week ago, I think. It's just popped up, but it's recovering. Contrast with New Jersey, which actually isn't visibly recovering right now. It looked like it was flattening out, but right now, according to the curve, according to our best guess, it is slightly, very slightly rising in new cases each day. So that's kind of flat, but more problematically, that line has risen. It has an upward slope, and we're seeing that number rise. So we'll keep an eye on New Jersey, but things aren't looking great for New Jersey right now. New York definitely, they were just lockstep for a while, but New York turned it around and New Jersey didn't, and now New Jersey's in the bottom of the pack. Virginia is okay, horizontal, very slow, very slight growth. Mississippi, very slightly downward, fairly small growth, and California actually headed slightly upwards. So the news is California is the second worst of all the states in this collection. I'll also flash Colorado for those who love Colorado. Colorado there is about in the middle of the pack. It's roughly horizontal, and it's not changing its growth rate, and its growth rate is quite small, the dropping rate about 2% fewer each day. Colorado is not quickly recovering, but it is recovering. If it can stay below that zero line, it will eventually have no new cases. So the news for Colorado is slightly good. News for California, though, with that rising and at 5% is not good. It's seeing a 5% day-over-day growth in new cases, and that growth is rising. So that's bad. But at least California isn't Ohio. We've seen Ohio break out of the pack just in a matter of days, really. It was a matter of days. It's been 1 week from when Ohio was doing this lovely little wave down to zero. We keep seeing this wave everywhere. I still don't know why that is. Maybe it's a weekly thing, weekly cyclic pattern. And I would have guessed if you blocked away all the points to the right of this one, Ohio had recovered, or at least it turned the corner towards recovery. But then suddenly it had this explosion of growth. These are averages of 3 days, each of these points. So the average on the 15th was 15% growth. 21% new cases average on the 16th. 27% new cases. 33% new cases. 31% new cases, increase of cases. So it's just gone totally out of control. A 20% growth rate day over day it gets you very high very fast. Now, the very short-term news is looking better. We have 1 day that suddenly seems to have resumed the old trend. So maybe we have an entire outlier week here. But right now, Ohio has had it's had a very bad week. And we certainly can't say from this 3-day average that it's going to recover and be fine. We can't assume that this is the new trend. But we'll watch Ohio. So other than Ohio and with its very bad trend and 5 other states with slightly bad trends, all the states are looking good. In terms of testing, we still see Rhode Island. Rhode Island, again, is kind of a mixed bag. They've got the best testing by far. The slope of their line going upwards, which we'll also see here as as how many they're testing every day per million. They've tested 0.4% of the population in a single day there. They're testing extremely fast, and their rate of testing is growing. They're testing even more people every day, where most of the states picked some level, probably their capacity, and just leveled off. Somehow Rhode Island has been able to continually expand its capacity. So Rhode Island is doing great in testing. They've tested now almost 4% of their population. New York and Louisiana, and you might say, well, 4% of the population of Rhode Island isn't very many people compared to, say, 4% of New York, but the budgets are scale as well, and so it doesn't really matter the size of the place. If you can test 4% of your population, you're doing great, whether you're a big state or a little one. New York, Louisiana, Rhode Island, Massachusetts are sort of the leaders right now. New York and it looked like Louisiana was going to take over from New York, but they're pretty much tightly in a tight race here. But Rhode Island is the runaway favorite to win this race at this point. And then there's all the rest. In California will be terrible, because it always is. Where these are doing 4% of their population, California at this point has tested 0.8% of the population. And California is, at least it's slightly trending upward. Colorado, I do want to look at Georgia sometime today. Colorado is testing also pretty terribly. It's okay, 0.7% of the population is okay, but it's just obvious that it can be done a lot better. For instance, New York. So Colorado and California are way back there in the pack, along with Georgia. Let's take a look at Georgia, because Georgia is going to be an interesting one. I'm not here to necessarily say whether it's time for a state to open up or not. I'm just here to show you the data. But I do, as a scientist, like the idea that some states are opening up, if only because it will give us data to tell whether they should have. Now, Georgia is probably pushing the envelope more than anyone right now in choosing to relax their restrictions. A lot of states are talking about relaxing their restrictions in the next few weeks. Georgia has turned the corner here, but just barely. It certainly doesn't seem to be, if you compare it to the pack, it doesn't seem to be the one that you'd say, this one's doing so well, it should open first. If that were anyone, that would be Indiana, which really is doing quite well and could, if you wanted to try to open, if I had to choose who was going to relax restrictions, I'd say, how about Indiana? Georgia, though, in the middle of their epidemic, while they're still at zero growth, haven't really turned the corner, haven't stayed there, they're relaxing restrictions. And so we'll see whether Georgia becomes a new Ohio or whether they just continue downward. My guess is that when restrictions are relaxed, it won't send countries or states or counties into runaway pandemic, but it will slow their growth rate. I don't think that's a controversial statement. And so Georgia may continue downward at a very slow rate. But there are some fears, I think, that Georgia could suddenly shoot upwards. They have one day upwards, but that's too soon to say, and probably is not due to their new relaxation of shelter-in-place standards, so on. Okay, moving on to the counties of California. So California, again, was actually looking a little worse now. Let's go back and look at California for a minute in the graph that I think is most important, which is the rope chart. California, as we've seen before, a couple places we've seen this nice downward trend for a while, and then about a week ago, things got a little bit worse. California's had especially a few bad days. They had a 28% growth rate in cases over 3 days. And then we had a 12% growth of cases over 3 days. And it does not take much of that to send California back to the top. So why is that happening? Why is California seeing a growth of cases? Well, it's Los Angeles. It's really obvious on this graph. We'll show everyone, but Los Angeles is the biggest contributor. And Los Angeles has seen a spike, whereas they were quite flat, linear, maybe even turning down. Los Angeles now has seen 2 days of spike. Not enough to say much in terms of predictions, but it's very troubling. In terms of new daily coronavirus cases by county, Los Angeles here again was pretty flat, and they've seen a spike. They were seeing 300 to 600 cases a day, and now suddenly for 2 days they've seen, and these are actual days, not averages of 3 days, they've seen 1,500 cases, 1,400 cases in a single day. So Los Angeles suddenly is having some really bad days. Maybe these are just random outliers. My guess is not. Having seen 2 of them in a row, I'm thinking this is actually the beginning of a new trend, but we'll see. We'll see. It's rare to see a spike up here followed by another one and then see it drop back to its normal. So maybe it'll start to hover around 900 or something, but I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see 1200s or more going forward from Los Angeles. So that is very troubling. The other counties, it's really hard to even see what's up with the other counties unless we look at it per million. I'm going to zoom in on this if my graph will let me. It did. Per million, Los Angeles isn't such a problem. It has, or at least it's not the worst problem. It's been passed solidly by Riverside and Imperial. Now Imperial is a small contributor, so that's not to be believed quite as much. We have very few cases there, but the trend is very bad in Imperial, and if it continues, then we'll have many cases there. Riverside is much more concerning. Let's just compare these two in total cases. The total number of cases so far in Riverside versus the total number of cases so far in Imperial. We can see Imperial has a total of under 200 cases, while Riverside has well over 2,000, pushing 3,000 cases. So these are very different counties, both looking very much with the same trend, though, of a rising number of daily cases. We'll see better on the rope chart what that's really going to look like. And not just rising, but to my eye, these might even be tilting slightly upwards. They're not getting better. Let's just go to the rope chart, my favorite chart, which will tell us more about this. Fresno, interestingly, is actually the worst county right now in terms of growth rate. It's got 17% growth rate and rising. Los Angeles, as we've seen, is experiencing a new upsurgence. Maybe 2 days is not much to look at, but when you do the rolling average of the past 3 days in Los Angeles, it's a bad enough number that it has decidedly turned this trend line upwards. I think this is real. I think we're going to find that this is real. That Los Angeles really is losing its grip here. It will recover, but it looks like it's coming into another bump. 10% new cases per day on average and rising. San Bernardino, also a high rate of cases, 10% new per day, but at least dropping a little bit. But Fresno, which is not a major contributor, but still not, it's in the top 20, I guess. Fresno is seeing 18% and rising, so Fresno has a problem. We'll have to keep our eye on that too. Other challenged countries, Marin, slightly upwards, 7% and rising. These two, Santa Cruz and Stanislaus, I think just yesterday they were very slightly upwards. Now they're very slightly downwards, but still rising on whole. Neither of them have very many cases, I think. Yeah, Stanislaus is down there too. Santa Cruz has actually dropped to 25th and will probably just disappear. So this is nothing to be really worried about in Santa Cruz. There just aren't many cases in Santa Cruz. Stanislaus, and by the way, if I'm saying that wrong, tell me. I was saying Placer before, and someone said that's not right. It's Placer. At least I hope that's Placer is the right name. I don't hear these county names very often. Don't actually know how to pronounce them necessarily, but I'm going to go with Stanislaus unless I hear differently. San Diego has never been great. We're going to look at San Diego a little bit separately. And then there's a cluster of several around zero, but everyone else is doing okay. By and large, the majority of counties seem to be doing well. They're below zero, they're trending downward. Sonoma is great, Ventura is great, Sacramento is also pretty great, Tulare and San Luis Obispo are great. If they're when they're below zero and aimed downward, that's great, especially if they're way below zero. And all of these are at least 10% fewer new cases each day. Placer is pretty good. It's not. It's pretty far down there, and you do trend towards zero growth as the cases drop. It gets a little noisy, but eventually it falls off. It falls off the list entirely. We don't even see it anymore. Solano is doing well. All of these, this whole little cluster here, are all below zero, if only slightly, and trending downward. So the counties as a whole are doing fine, except Fresno, and then Los Angeles is certainly the biggest problem. Even though it's not quite as steep as Fresno, even though it's not quite as high as Fresno, Los Angeles, in terms of the way the state goes, is a big problem if this is at 10% and rising. So certainly the bad news here is Los Angeles, and we'll check in tomorrow or maybe the next day about whether that's trending, continuing to be the trend for Los Angeles to look bad. In testing per county, it's oh wait, I was going to look at one of these. Which one was I going to look at? I was going to look at San Diego. Yeah, so Los Angeles number 1, but San Diego number 2. This also is problematic, and also like Los Angeles has seen a sudden recent spike. Just one day, I'm not going to believe it, but if we see 2 in a row, maybe, and 3 in a row, definitely. So let's wait a couple days. So San Diego has been pulled upwards slightly in its trend line, especially by that 1 point, but generally it's about flat at zero, no recovery happening, no growth happening. San Diego is hanging in there, but is not getting better. So that's a problem, especially for the second most contributing county. Let me see how the difference is. It's nowhere near Los Angeles, I know, but let's just see how close it is. So yeah, it's got 2,400 cases versus 15,000, 2,000 versus 15,000. San Diego is far away and is, as we see, is relatively flat in its line, and we can also see that here, that San Diego, well, this would indicate that it's trending downward, but we have that one new data point that's starting to have us wonder about that. So we'll watch San Diego. The news is mixed on San Diego. Counties as a whole, San Francisco is doing quite good testing. Riverside, which we had no data for the longest time, and which is really a significant problem county, is now showing us data about testing. For the past 6 days, we've actually seen Riverside's testing, and Riverside's testing is good. There's something clearly wrong in this data, because this is the total population tested, the total percent, and it's saying, well, we had tested 1.2 and then 1.3 total and then 1.3 total and 1.3 total. These were the same, and then we tested 1.24. There's no way that we had tested fewer people total on the 20th than we tested on the 19th, and or this as well. So I don't know quite what to make of this, but I'm gonna hope that generally this number is correct. Riverside really is has tested more than 1% of their population. But the exact numbers are not coming in correctly in some way. San Francisco also doing very well. San Mateo, Marin, Santa Clara, and San Diego. San Diego then is doing pretty well with its testing. Los Angeles 0.88. We really would like to see better than that. We know that you can do 3% if you're Rhode Island, so why not if you're Los Angeles? So this is pretty much the end of the presentation today, and I'll finish as I always finish by saying California isn't doing enough testing, and it's just got to do more. It's just got to do more. A lot of other states are doing more. I am taking a non-data position there, which is that testing will help with the epidemic. That again is something we'll know later. We'll eventually learn whether testing actually factually helps control the epidemic, but it sure seems like it should. So don't feel like I'm going out on much of a limb here and saying we should spend a lot of money on testing. We're spending a lot of money on a lot of other things in this epidemic, and whatever, I don't know, priority orders or war orders we can do to force countries to make or force other force companies to make testing kits, I think is probably a good idea. And that's happening, but for some reason, not in California. Why is California doing so much worse than Rhode Island? Inquiring minds want to know. That is the news for today. Broadly, then, the news for California is okay. The testing isn't great, but the news is okay. But Los Angeles has run away with it and is not looking good. The big picture for the states is quite good, with the exception of Ohio, which is bizarrely run away. And the big picture for countries is good. That's his deaths. I was going to say, that doesn't look good. Yeah, the growth in cases, assuming it's going to let me do this, the picture for countries is good, with the exception of a couple of smaller contributors, Ecuador and Saudi Arabia. Every country is looking good. So the news is good. I'm Greg Farrar, and thanks for watching.